Hung Denzaguru Pema Siddhi Hung Ong Ahung Denzaguru Pema Siddhi Hung Ong Ahung Denzaguru Pema Siddhi Hung. Okay, let's begin. Welcome everyone to my weekly Dharma talk, Tuesday at 4 o'clock, Second Lifetime, here at the Chitta Bhavana Ashram. Today we're going to be doing my summation talk for the series of talks that I've been giving at the Buddha Center over the past 34 weeks, more or less. We've been discussing, those of us who have been attending the talks at the Buddha Center, we've been discussing all 34 talks of the Digha Nikaya, the first book of the Sutta Pitaka of the Pali Canon, in some depth. And today I will summarize the main points that have emerged during the course of these talks. This will of necessity be a high-level summary, so it may appear somewhat arbitrary if you have not attended the previous sessions. However, if you have not attended the previous series of talks, I suggest that you look on this talk as an introduction, and then take a look at the series, about 100,000 words, on my blog at www.palisuttas.com, or even buy the book when it's available. As some of you will probably already be aware, we will also be holding up, we've done the draw actually, pardon me. We've done the draw, so that is past history now. So let's begin. Let's start with discussing the Buddhist worldview, and specifically we're going to start with a discussion of Samsara. So we're going to move in, although the Buddha himself started with immediate experience, the conventional philosophical approach is, of course, to begin with ontology, and that's how we're going to present this talk. We're going to move from ontology to spirituality and ultimately to the immediacy of individual experience. Samsara, often translated rebirth, refers literally to time, which in the Buddhist worldview is cyclical. Thus, universes appear, expand, contract, and disappear in endlessly recurring cycles over vast eons of time. Samsara must be beginningless because to posit a beginning to existence posits the problem of a creator, which leads to an infinite regression. Moreover, how can there be a time before time? Therefore, time itself is paradoxically timeless, an eternal present or now. 4 cycles of time called kalpas in Pali, kalpa in Sanskrit, are referred to in the Pali Canon. Kalpa is generally translated as age, eon, or, or epoch. The 4 kalpas are referred to as the Ayu Kalpa, the life age, the Antara Kalpa, or small age, the Asankhya Kalpa, or medium age, and the Mahakapa, the great age. The life age is the human lifespan, which in the Buddhist view ranges from a low of 10 years to a maximum of 80 or 84,000 years. Although some may doubt this longevity, there are tree colonies on the earth that are 80,000 years old, so we do know that there are living beings that do live that long, even within our terrestrial experience. And some scientists believe that human functional immortality is within reach. Some say within the next 20 or 30, as soon as the next 20 or 30 years. Michio Kaku, the great string theorist, certainly one of the most intelligent people on the planet, has actually stated in a YouTube video that I've seen that there are children today who will live to be 1,000 years old. We're that close. The small kappa is the time it takes for the life kappa to increase to the maximum and then decrease back to the minimum again. 20 small ages make a medium age. 4 medium ages make a great age. According to the Pali English Dictionary, if a kappa is referred to with no other qualifier, a great age is implied. Each small age ends in a mass extinction event by famine, pestilence, or war. The great ages end in destruction by fire, water, or air. So the small ages seem to refer primarily to living beings, the great ages to perhaps geological or astronomical events. I remember when the idea of evolution punctuated by violent cataclysms used to be considered occult nonsense associated with people like Gurdjieff, Uspensky, and Velikovsky. Both extraterrestrial and terrestrial cataclysms are, however, now accepted as fact. That the moon was broken off from the primordial Earth by a violent impact between the Earth and a large asteroid or planetoid is now accepted as fact. 6 major extinction events are also known. 450 to 440 million years ago, caused by global cooling and sea level drop. 375 to 360 million years ago, caused by multiple causes. 252 million years ago, again, caused by multiple causes. 3 million years ago, caused by climate change, an asteroid impact, or volcanism. 66 million years ago, the most recent, caused by the Chicxulub asteroid. This was an asteroid about 10 kilometers or 6 miles in diameter that impacted in the region of Chicxulub, Mexico. This caused the extinction of the planet's non-avian dinosaurs and other species. And the 6th and last mass extinction event is occurring right now and is human-caused. In addition, Wikipedia lists 26 extinction events. The oldest, about 2,400 million years ago, called the Great Oxygenation Event. The most recent of which, besides the currently ongoing one, occurred about 13,000 years ago. The last 5 such events have an average periodicity of about 3 million years, whereas the average lifespan of species vary between about 500,000 and 13 million years, with a median rate of 5 million years. And for comparison, the human species is about 2.8 million years old. That is the hominid species. In some passages, the Buddha implies that the small, medium, and great ages, while definite, are so vast that they are incalculable. This is the famous metaphor. He used a number of metaphors to illustrate it. One famous metaphor is he compares the length of an age to the time it would take to wear away a mountain if a cloth was brushed against it once every century. However, the classical formulation gives a rate of 1 year per century. Thus, the small age, is equal to 84,000 minus 10 times 2 times 100 equals 16.798 million years. 20 small ages, which is 1 medium age, is 335.96 million years, therefore. And 4 medium ages, which makes 1 great age, is 1,343.84 million years ago. All of these cycles, therefore, fall into the 2,400 million year period mentioned above. The Earth itself was created about 4.54 billion years ago, or just over 3 Mahakapas ago. Thus, the Buddhist concept of the history of the world is entirely consistent with the scientific evaluation, in striking contrast to the Semitic religions, which believe that God created the universe, including all species of life, out of nothing, just about 6,000 years ago, over the course of a single week. Next, we're going to discuss the law of karma. The law of karma is ubiquitous, and one of its applications is the science of physiognomy, by which the karmic inheritance of an individual can be assessed based on their physical characteristics, defined by the 32 and 80 marks. Today we would associate this with an individual's genetic inheritance, and actually I'm indebted, that's not my association, the Dalai Lama has actually mentioned that in one of his talks. An individual who has all of the marks is destined to become a universal ruler or a universal teacher. Such ideas may also find expression in the notion of caste. However, it is clear that the Buddha rejected the Indian notion of caste because he believed that intention could override inheritance. Thus, an individual of good birth, a concept that the Buddha clearly did not reject, is not necessarily destined to lead a superior life, nor is a person of inferior birth destined to lead an inferior life. Because karma is also generated by intention, intention creates new karma that can in turn result in a superior outcome than what might otherwise be expected, while old karma is always being eliminated by a process of maturation and can also be negated by acts of renunciation and self-purification. For this reason, the Buddha rejected the rigid notions of caste and class and admitted members of all castes and classes into the Sangha, with only a few exceptions. The Buddha appears to have taken a similar attitude to race. The Buddha also implies that karmic patterns, including human associations, repeat themselves from life to life, leading to people who were associated in past lives being associated in future lives. Thus, many of the people you are closest to are probably people that you've known before. Next, we'll discuss dependent origination. The Buddha applied the general principle of the law of karma in various ways, the most famous being his principle of dependent origination, or paticca samuppada. The literal meaning of this word is paticca, following from anything as a necessary result, plus sam, together, plus upada, coming into existence, or upada, I should say, coming into existence. Essentially, it means that every cause is an effect, every effect is a cause, and that the two are always occur together. That is, no cause without an effect, no effect without a cause. This was discussed at some length by Nagarjuna. From this, it follows that everything is connected with everything else, and that there are no coincidences and no accidents, but the interconnections are infinitely complex. And interestingly, this principle was only proven scientifically in the 1960s in Bell's theorem, which is a development in quantum physics. The principle that samsara is without beginning also follows logically from the law of karma, for that would posit an uncaused cause. In fact, this principle of causality is very much the same as in science, with one important distinction: mind. Buddhism recognizes the reality of six senses, the sixth sense being mind. Since the existence of a sense necessarily posits the existence of objects corresponding to that sense, Buddhism refers to mind objects that are real entities, essentially no different from the objects of sight, hearing, the tactile sense, etc. And this is very interesting, this fact that because we have a sense, the existence of that sense really demonstrates the reality of objects corresponding to that sense. Otherwise, there would be the sense would make no sense. The reality of mind objects means that the mind can interact with reality in ways that are indeterminate, because intention is essentially free, not merely a reflex of material causes. This must be true because reality itself must be unconditioned. In our very essence, we ourselves, as human beings, are the product of reality, and therefore, in our essence, we must be unconditioned also. Thus, the Buddhist universe is an open, creative, evolving, expanding universe where anomalies such as psychic powers and even magic become possible against a backdrop of overall high-level order, the integrity of which is maintained by karma. Yes, the Buddhist worldview allows for the possibility of magic. The utility of mantras, which focus and concentrate mind and intention in specific ways based on vast reservoirs of psychic power or energy, built up over thousands or even millions of years, also falls into this category. You can learn more about this if you look up the concept of the egregore in Wikipedia. There's a whole discussion of this concept. Buddhism is not materialism. As a non-materialist, spiritual, metaphysical philosophy, Buddhism preserves the essential humanity of the person in a way that scientific materialist ideologies like communism, fascism, capitalism, scientism, and technocracy do not. We see this increasingly today as the advance of industrialism strips us ever more and more wantonly of our essential human rights and freedoms, even while pretending to do the opposite. For this reason, the Dharma transmission to the West is essential for the future survival of humanity as we understand it. The Buddha also discovered that paticca samuppada is bidirectional, what we would call the arrow of time. In the full formulation, proliferation and ignorance, which give rise to the 5 aggregates and the 6 senses, including the karmic propensities, the sanskaras in Pali, which together constitute the self, in quotation marks, are followed by contact, craving, feeling, clinging, and becoming, and to culminate in birth, aging, death, and angst. This is the arrow of time that leads from past to future states, what we call entropy. However, the essential impermanence of samsara and its constituent processes means that because they are ultimately transitory and ephemeral, they are subject to change, and therefore they can be reversed, especially craving and ignorance, which are both directly and intimately subject to intention. Although intention is conditioned by the karmic propensities, it is essentially free, as I said, that is, it is identical with reality itself. Thus, by realizing the truth about samsara, one overcomes ignorance, and by cultivating dispassion, one overcomes clinging, thus freeing oneself from the chain of cause and effect and returning to the source, the mind stream, the continuity of consciousness, reality itself. This is the theoretical basis of the path. The Buddha compares this doctrine to a tangled ball of string and emphasizes its impenetrability. He who fully realizes the truth of paticca samuppada, he says, has realized emptiness, or the essential voidness of phenomena, which is ultimately equivalent to awakening or enlightenment itself. Next, we're going to discuss merit, and the transfer of merit, also known as the dedication of merit, with which we also end our talks. The law of karma leads logically to the concept of merit. Every life at any given moment is a veritable stew of positive and negative karmas, working themselves out in complex interactive patterns of experience based on conditions in the environment, which are themselves the result of karma and its interaction with intention, which is the ultimate cause of karma. Reality is therefore a self-reflexive feedback loop. Thus, every person has a store of positive and negative merit, which they can draw upon at any time. We may think of this as a sort of energy potential. This energy can also be directed by intention to various ends, thus allowing us to affect our experience and the experiences of others based on the principle of dependent origination. Next, the power of truth. The concept of merit leads in turn to the power of truth, an ancient Indian doctrine that also pervades the Pali Canon, based on the idea that truth, when unmitigated and absolute, has an inherent power that can be drawn upon and directed. This power arises out of the essential identity of truth and reality. Truth, in effect, is an expression of the inertia or power of reality. The greatest psychic power of all, related to the power of truth, is the miracle of instruction, by which beings are saved from samsara and become able to transcend phenomenal existence altogether, which is ultimately identical with wisdom, the antithesis of ignorance or not knowing. The power of truth is especially efficacious at the moment of death, leading to a doctrine and a praxis of conscious dying, which one finds worked out in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, the so-called Polwa, and elsewhere. Every Buddhist should prepare for the moment of death with the utmost care to ensure that their subsequent rebirth is as beneficial as possible. The path of the householder is largely based on the law of karma, merit, and the transfer of merit and the power of truth. However, the rigid distinction between lay people and monastics found in later Buddhism is largely absent in the Pali Canon. Householders not only converted to the Buddha Dharma, but also were able to attain emancipation as well, at which time they either died or became monastics. On the other hand, many monastics made little spiritual progress at all, thus resulting in the distinction documented by Peter Macefield in his book Divine Revelation in the Pali Canon, between Putujana and Arya monastics. Next, we'll discuss cosmology and the ecstasies. In all of the wisdom traditions of antiquity, no fundamental division is made between ontology and psychology. Rather, mind is regarded as a sixth sense, and therefore mind objects are ontologically real, and mind participates actively in the creation of reality. Therefore, mind is reality, and reality is mind. This is in striking contrast to Western philosophical theories rooted in Descartes, who decisively separated mind and matter. The West has finally abandoned the reality of mind altogether in scientific, in quotes, materialism, scientific materialism, which I would call scientism, which asserts that mind is essentially an epiphenomenon of matter and therefore unreal. Thus, in Buddhism, realization corresponds to the progressive realization of more and more subtle states of reality. The former refers to the four jhanas, or ecstasies, whereas the latter are the four deva realms, referred to as the Brahma worlds, corresponding to the first jhana, the radiant devas, corresponding to the second jhana, the glorious devas, corresponding to the third jhana, the five pure abodes, corresponding to the fourth jhana, the sphere of infinite space, corresponding to the fifth jhana, the sphere of infinite consciousness, corresponding to the sixth jhana, the sphere of no-thing or nothing, corresponding to the seventh jhana, and finally the sphere of neither perception nor non-perception, the highest sphere of samsara, corresponding to the eighth jhana. However, the realization of the fourth jhana is sufficient to attain emancipation, suggesting another difference between the Arhat and the Buddha, which we're going to be discussing, or between an Arhat and the Buddha, who attained the realization of the eighth sphere. The first four jhanas, or spheres as they are called, correspond to the world of form, and the second four jhanas or spheres correspond to the world of formlessness. The planes of ordinary consciousness correspond to the sensual world. Altogether, these constitute the realms or worlds of samsara, which are further elaborated into 31 planes of existence, including subhuman, human, and transhuman worlds. Thus, we say that the human world is the middle world, and the world in which realization is most possible. Human rebirth is both rare and is considered to be the result of merit. So if merit is not cultivated in the present life, it could easily be lost in future lives. This matters because anti-gods, ghosts, and hell beings do seem to remember their past lives, whereas and devas as well, of course, whereas animals do not, and human beings only in rare circumstances. The worlds below the human, the worlds of anti-gods, ghosts, animals, and hell beings, are so pervaded by suffering and instinctuality/automaticity that it takes a very long time to break out of them, whereas the deva worlds above the human world are so long-lived and pleasurable that the devas have little motivation to practice dharma. And I just have a little bit of a footnote on that point. Let me just find it. This is something I added since my original presentation of the talk. The longevity of devas is explicitly associated with their high energy or luminous state or vibration, in quotes, resulting in the phenomenon of time dilation, described by Einstein and subsequently proved by experiment. Thus, the longevity of devas is a relativistic phenomenon. The ratio of deva to human time / longevity increases as one rises on the planes, and the exact correlations are given in the Pali Canon, thus allowing one to precisely calculate the vibratory rate of each deva class as a function of the speed of light, using the equation known as the Lorentz transformation. Sorry, I just have to find my place again. There we go. So these planes or levels of consciousness become ever more rarefied, blissful, and powerful as one progresses up the ladder, corresponding to the gradual path culminating in cessation. Cessation, however, is, strictly speaking, not part of this series at all, rather like the sphere of Dat in the Kabbalistic tree of life, for those of you who study Kabbalah. Rather, cessation represents the qualitative transcendence of the whole system of samsara altogether, and the realization of an immanent state, the clear light, or Buddha nature, which has always been present in the form of an essential potentiality. Thus, cessation is not produced or caused. This suggests the possibility of an alternative to the causal path, namely an acausal transcendence of the whole system that may occur in principle at any time and is therefore immediate and spontaneous. And in fact, the Pali Canon refers to enlightenment in different places in terms of both the causal and acausal path, but the actual experience of enlightenment itself, as distinct from the path that leads up to that experience, is intrinsically acausal. The character of this ultimate realization, literally the action of making real, is beyond samsara. As such, it is beyond all rational categories of thought, based as they are on the law of contradiction, that is, duality. Thus, reality is transdual, transrational, translinguistic, and uncharacterizable, signless, boundless, and all-luminous. And those of you who've studied the Pali Canon, of course, will recognize this as a description of the Tao. This, the essence of sentience itself, is essentially empty and full, differentiated and undifferentiated, proliferating and non-proliferating simultaneously. And this appears to be the basis of the Buddha's dislike of speculation, not because he does not have an ontology, but rather because his ontology is transcendental, and therefore not truly accessible to the unenlightened mind. This is also the basis of the Two Truth doctrine. Ultimate truth is transdual, transrational, translinguistic, and uncharacterizable, whereas relative truth is non-absolute, and therefore misleading if it is understood to be absolute, and especially if one becomes attached to it. Buddha makes it quite clear, various places in the Pali Canon, that one can become attached to dogmas and beliefs, and that this is a negative thing. One can even, in fact, become attached to the notion of non-attachment, and this makes non-attachment itself a negative thing. On the other hand, it is possible through the intensive cultivation of wisdom to obtain an intuition of realization that may precipitate the actual experience in one suitably prepared. And there is a passage in the Digha Nikaya, I believe it's in the Digha Nikaya, where Ananda actually identifies this as one of the ways of achieving enlightenment or awakening. The Buddha was a very clever dialectician, and he often dialogued with others by appearing to accept their premises, identifying common ground, and then subtly shifting the conversation through a progressive process of inference and deduction, causing them to see beyond their premises. This establishes Buddhism as an esoteric tradition, in that the Buddha is reinterpreting outer in terms of inner and relating this to a forgotten primordial tradition that can only be appreciated by the few. He says right at the beginning of his career that his doctrine really is only for the few. The Buddha declares that his Dharma is ancient and long forgotten, and is identical with the way of the ancient Vedic rishis. Merely mouthing sacred texts does not, however, constitute realization, and for this reason the Buddha rejected the notion of innate Brahman caste superiority. A Brahmin must live the life. He must live a life of utmost simplicity and renunciation. The Buddha also tailored his recommendations to the spiritual needs of the individuals with whom he communicated. So he said different, even apparently contradictory things at different times and in different circumstances. This can lead to error if it is not understood, which is why the method of logical syncretism or transcendental synthesis is the best way to study the Dharma. This effectively disproves fundamentalism because it shows that the Dharma is constantly adapting itself to the circumstances of the people to whom it is communicated. Obviously, the Dharma that we teach and practice today, 2,500 years later, is going to be different from the Dharma as it was understood 2,500 years ago. This is actually, in the Western tradition, this is actually the definition of theology. We can't just pick out the ideas we like and ignore those that we do not either. All this leads to is the creation of a false Dharma, which is merely a projection of our own egotism/narcissism, the spiritual supermarket, as it's often called today. Thus, we reject fundamentalism and sectarianism from the outset. Next, I'd like to discuss devas. Rather popular topic, I think. An oft-repeated refrain of the stock description of a Buddha is that he is a teacher of humans and devas. The Pali Canon frequently alludes to deva followers of the Buddha, including even anti-gods, interestingly, but their numbers are not numerous. Devas of the sensual world in particular seem to be, because there are devas among us, in the Kamaloka, the sensual world. We're not the top of the hierarchy by any means. So devas of the sensual world in particular seem to be addicted to sensual pleasures much as many humans are, especially in the latter days of the degenerate age in which we now live. Some devas are even earthbound, living invisibly in human cities and influencing human beings, and even governments telepathically. This is explicitly stated in the Pali Canon. There are even deva cities, both in deva worlds and on the earth, Uttarakuru being an example that is mentioned in the Pali Canon. Interestingly, the word deva means, usually translated deity or god, really poor translation of the word. Literally, it means shining one. And the Pali descriptions of devas often correspond strikingly, which I was delighted to discover. I didn't expect to discover this when I was studying the Pali Canon, but I was delighted to discover, surprised and delighted to discover that they correspond strikingly with the UFO phenomenon, which we know now, thanks to the research of people like Jacques Vallée, probably the world's foremost expert on the topic, J. Allen Hynek, an astronomer, and others. We know that UFOs now do have a physical reality, a physical aspect. The Buddha himself is represented as communicating with devas, teaching them and receiving teachings from them. The Pali Canon also describes a war in heaven. Putting that in quotes, this is a metaphor, but the war in heaven, we find that in the Western tradition also, between the asuras, or the asuras, archaic deities representing abstract spiritual principles and the powers of nature, and the devas. This appears to correspond to the arising of a new religious movement within the Vedic tradition during the late Vedic period, approximately 1000 to 500 before the Common Era, characterized by the forgetting of the recipe for soma and its replacement by a surrogate ritual called the fire sacrifice, ritualism, caste, authoritarianism, and misogyny. Many of the things for which the Buddha criticized the Brahmins of his time. The asuras, which originally meant lords, but was now associated with an erroneous etymology of asuras, anti-gods, were cast down to the foot of Mount Sumeru, where they dwelt in the one-world ocean. The anti-gods were still necessary to churn soma, apparently, which they churn out of the one-world ocean together with the devas. This antagonism or conflict itself appears to be necessary for the production of soma, which makes one wonder how soma was manufactured before the war between the devas and the asuras, since soma or amrita is referred to as the drink of the gods. This point requires additional research. I don't have an answer to it at this stage. The anti-gods also attended an assembly of devas held to honor the Buddha, and some even converted to the Buddha Dharma. In the West, the conflict between the devas and the asuras resulted in the devas being cast down, and an asura, Ahura Mazda, became the chief deity of the Zoroastrian religion, precise inversion of what happened in the East. Also based, however, on the principle of dualistic conflict. And this, of course, the principle of dualism in Zoroastrianism strongly influenced the Christian notion of God and Satan, the conflict of God and Satan. So summarizing the characteristics of the Devas as I've identified them from the Digha Nikaya, the principles I've identified are that the Devas visit the Buddha and that he learns from them, that Deva travel is instantaneous, that Devas manifest as luminous aerial phenomena, that Devas are only visible to those of refined mindfulness, that some Devas live invisibly among men on earth, called earthbound, and that the anti-gods are skilled in the practice of magic. Finally, I'm going to conclude this discussion of ontology, before we go on to discuss the spiritual path, with the Buddhist view of God. Although Buddhism is widely regarded as atheistic or non-theistic, this is not quite true. God is referred to several times in the Pali Canon, in the form of the chief of the Brahma realm, a sort of Wizard of Oz figure. The texts explain how the notion of God originates. According to the Buddhist worldview, universes appear, expand, contract, and then disappear and reappear in an endless series of cycles. Historical time is also like this and passes through evolutionary and devolutionary phases. The beings that previously were reborn in a universe that passes into a state of potentiality are reborn in other worlds corresponding to their karma. When the universe reappears, it exists in a high energy state, and higher devas are reborn in it as their merit in higher worlds is exhausted. The first such deva to appear finds himself alone in the universe and erroneously concludes that he is the creator of the universe, very similar, in fact, to the concept of the demiurge or demiurgos in Gnosticism. Similarly, the devas that come after see that he came before, and they erroneously conclude that he is the creator of the universe. Thus, he asserts himself to be God, and they accept this and worship him as God, resulting in the creation of religion. Thus, the delusion of belief in God arises in beings. Moreover, for this reason and others, Buddhism itself cannot be regarded as a religion, properly speaking, and in fact it has not been legally acknowledged as a religion historically in many places for exactly this reason. Buddhism is a metaphysical and practical spiritual philosophy, not a religion. Okay, on that note, let's go on to discuss the spiritual path, beginning with the primordial tradition. Far from declaring himself to be an innovator or the originator of a new truth or a new religious movement, the Buddha claimed to be revealing an ancient way that has long been forgotten, which he identifies with the progenitors of the Brahmins, the ancient Vedic rishis, illuminated seers consisting of both men and women, whose ecstatic poems are recorded in the Vedas, but which is also pre-Vedic. Thus he is revealing to the Brahmins, who he castigates as degenerate, the original truth of Brahmanism itself. He compares this to an ancient and long-forgotten city in the midst of an archaic forest, the path to which is overgrown and barely discernible. So let's discuss the true Brahman. The Buddha declares that the true Brahman is one who has wisdom and virtue, not someone born into a caste. Someone born into the Brahmin caste and who does not have these essential qualities is not a Brahmin. And someone who is not born into the Brahmin caste but who has these essential qualities is, according to the Buddha, a Brahmin, in accordance with the law of karma. The same distinction applies to monastics. One may be a monastic and a putujana, or a common person, or one may be a householder and be an Aryan, a noble or spiritual person. Monastic ordination does not, by itself, an Aryan make. Thus, both Hinayana and Mahayana traditions allow for self-ordination. In the Mahayana tradition, this is found primarily in the Brahmanet Sutra and the Srimala Sutra. The Buddha himself, however, there are also self-ordained monastics in the Theravada tradition, especially the forest monastics of Thailand, many of whom were not associated with the temple and were not self-ordained. The Buddha himself was, of course, self-ordained. Of these two, wisdom and not virtue is the preeminent salvific principle, with virtue as its necessary basis, subject to the qualification concerning ethics that we've discussed in previous talks, and which will also be mentioned. I'm not sure if I've mentioned it already in this talk, but I will be mentioning it if I haven't already. However, a tree is known by its fruits, as to quote a saying. The Dharma always yields good fruits. One has to be careful with this, though, too, because a medicine may taste bitter and yet be good for you, so you have to be careful judging what is good and what is bad. In the Buddhist worldview, good and bad are very much situational and relative. The path of the Arhat. The Buddha teaches the path of the Arhat, the noble eightfold path, consisting of 4 levels of attainment of degrees of progressive realization or accomplishment. The stream entrant, whereby one achieves emancipation within 7 rebirths without ever experiencing a lower non-human rebirth. A once returner, whereby one is reborn as a human being once more only. A non-returner, whereby one is never again reborn as a human being, but will be reborn as a Deva being in the 5 pure abodes. So that answers the question of whether a Deva can attain enlightenment, at least at that level. The answer is yes. Or an Arhat, in which one on death achieves Nibbana, literally complete snuffing out as of a fire. I often translate it emancipation, but literally it means complete snuffing out. It used to be translated extinction or even annihilation. And subsequent immortality, or amata. This Pali word, amata, pervades the Pali canon and is generally translated as deathlessness. If you go to my blog, you'll find I've chosen that as the motto for the blog, open are the doors of the deathless. One finds that refrain all through the Pali canon. But the Pali English dictionary makes it clear that the primary meaning is amrita, translated by Rhys Davids as ambrosia, or water of immortality, from the Sanskrit root mr, which means death. And you'll notice that in Latin, mor, which is the root, of course, of the English word mortality and mortal. Amrita, which is also described in the Pali English dictionary as a medicine, is the Buddhist word for soma, the Vedic mind-altering beverage that is identical with the plant-based psychedelic that was worshipped by the early Aryans and inspired the rishis, including the 7 sages, to write the ecstatic hymns of the Rig Veda. Mata means both thought and dead, or death. So the state of amata is a state beyond both death and thinking. Paradoxically, a state of apparent impercipience is identical with the realization of essential sentience itself, hence deathlessness. However, the Pali Canon also refers to the path of the Buddha. Although the Buddha taught the path of the Arhat as the fast path to nirvana, interesting comparison there with Tantra, because Tantra claims to teach the fast path to Buddhahood. But the Buddha taught the path of the Arhat as the fast path to nirvana based on dispassion, and the Buddha himself is declared to be an Arhat. But it's clear from the Pali text that an Arhat is not identical with a Buddha. A Buddha is an Arhat, but an Arhat is not a Buddha. The path that leads to Buddhahood is the path of a bodhisattva, literally an enlightenment being. That's the Sanskrit/English word. The Pali word is bodhisattva. The essential distinction appears to be that between dispassion, in which desirous attachment is negated, thus breaking the chain of dependent origination, and wisdom, in which ignorance is resolved by a kind of omniscience. And I emphasize a kind of omniscience, because the Buddha didn't actually claim, Mahavira claimed literal omniscience. The Buddha claims, or there is a claim in the Pali Canon, for the Buddha of a kind of qualified omniscience, which isn't quite the same thing as the Jain conception. The Pali Canon, rather, makes a clear distinction between the powers or attainments of Arahants and the powers or attainments of Buddhas. This idea was taken up by the Mahayana, which originally consisted of followers of the Hinayana who formulated the intention, known as bodhicitta, to attain Buddhahood out of compassion for all samsaric beings, rather than arhatship. And it's important to realize, we think today of Mahayana and Hinayana as two schools of Buddhism which are inextricably opposed to each other. This is actually a simplification. The Mahayana, what is now referred to as the Mahayana, actually arose within the Hinayana. And the original precursors of the Mahayana school were not separate and were not regarded as separate from the Hinayana. In fact, there was no concept of Hinayana. They lived together. They lived in the same monasteries. They went to the same lectures. They read the same fundamental body of suttas. The Mahayanas also read other suttas in addition to the fundamental suttas, but they arose within the Hinayana. It was only after a period of centuries that the Mahayana and the Hinayana became separate. And even today, if you look at the Bodhisattva vow, you will see that it is a downfall of the Bodhisattva vow in Hinayana to disparage the Hinayana in any way or to discourage anyone from pursuing the Hinayana. So while it may be true that the contemporary successes, the contemporary school sect of the Hinayana, the only one which survived, with the Theravada, of course, they may reject Mahayana and generally do. The Mahayana does not actually reject the Hinayana. The Hinayana rejects the Mahayana, but the Mahayana does not reject the Hinayana. And originally, they did not reject each other, or at least not in this way that they do today. The question arises, of course, why the Buddha chose to teach the path of the Arhat rather than the path of the Bodhisattva. That question does arise, and the answer seems to be, tentatively, this is my tentative answer, that he did this because of the severe limitations of beings born into this degenerate age, with lifespans limited to only 100 years or so. The Buddha says there's a great deal more. The Dharma is much larger than what he is actually teaching. He says that in the Pali Canon. And I'm still researching this question and may have additional insights on this point in the future, but that is my tentative answer to that question as of this moment. When a bodhisattva becomes a Buddha, he creates a negentropic information wave that radiates out in all directions from its point of origin, the so-called bodhiseat, creating a world age which expands and dissipates over a long period. This is the Dharma transmission. Thus, we find that human civilization, focused in northeast India, decreases in all directions as a function of distance. Because each such age has its unique origin in the appearance of one unique Buddha, it is said that no other Buddha can appear in that world age until its Dharma manifestation dissipates. So I call it a Dharma bubble. But the Dharma itself, of course, is timeless and never dissipates. We're talking about the phenomenal manifestation of Dharma, not the Dharma itself. The motive power of this expansion is the power of truth. The current Dharma age originated in the Paranibbana of Siddhartha Gautama Buddha in about 400 before the Common Era, according to the increasingly prevalent contemporary calculation, and is only now beginning to penetrate Western civilization at the midpoint of the 5,000-year cycle. That, the Buddha said, would be the duration of his Dharma manifestation. This corresponds to the year 2100, approximately. Thus, we see that the 21st century seems to represent a turning point in human civilization, both the nadir of the degenerate age of the last 1,000 years, culminating in 2012, the end of the Mayan epoch that also corresponds with the advent of the Kali Yuga. There's only an 11-year difference between them. And with the possibility of a transformative Buddha emanation that may propel human beings into a new evolutionary period, or alternatively, the extinction of the human species on this earth, depending on how we choose to respond to it. And 3 guesses where our current direction is headed. Buckminster Fuller has a very interesting book in which he makes exactly this point called utopia or oblivion. He says, humanity is now at a point in its evolution where we have a really fundamental choice between utopia or oblivion. Continuing on, let's talk about super-knowledge. The Buddha enumerates the benefits of monastic life, including the 4 jhanas or ecstasies, sometimes translated, translated different ways, meditative accomplishments, meditative attainments. Trances is really common but bad translation. Ecstasies is the most literally correct translation, consisting of detachment, concentration, tranquility, and mental purity and clarification. There's 4 jhanas, and those are the essential characteristics of each one in sequence. It's a sequence, culminating in the perfection of insight. A group of magical or psychic powers, which were clearly considered seriously as Moggallana, one of the 2 foremost disciples of the Buddha, was reputed to be foremost in psychic powers, follows these. These include the creation of a mental body, visionary experiences, clairaudience, or the perception of spiritual sounds, telepathy, recalling past lives, and the divine eye, whereby one perceives patterns of karmic cause and effect imperceptible to others, culminating in perfect mindfulness and full awakening. The Buddha also emphasizes the importance of mindfulness of the body, referring to meditation on the body and the breath in terms that are frankly sensual. The great Theravadian scholar Buddhaghosa says that this focus on the body is a unique distinguishing characteristic of the Buddha Dharma. Next, the recollection of past lives. The Buddha frequently uses the motif of past lives to dramatize teachings in the present. Whether this was based on actual memories or as a dramatic device of the Buddha is unknown, but it developed into the idea that the Buddha was actually able to recall past lives, and that the psychic power is a characteristic of a Buddha. And we do, of course, find this phenomenon elsewhere as well, as particularly in the context of the psychedelic experience. This ability is strongly emphasized throughout the Pali Canon, unlike the other psychic powers which the Buddha considered to be of limited spiritual value. Next, ethics and morality. So I've alluded to this previously, now we'll discuss it further. Unlike most, perhaps all religions, the Buddhist suttas begin, the first sutta of the Digha Nikaya, with what the teaching is not. Surprisingly, much of this includes much of what is considered to be Buddhism today. Moreover, the Buddha decries emotional faith and insists that his followers should inquire into the Dharma dispassionately, using the faculty of reason and questioning, but without being limited by it or dependent upon it. And I should also point out that when he talks about using reason and questioning, he's not talking about the kind of a vicious, destructive skepticism, the kind of negativity, nihilistic skepticism, which one finds masquerading as skepticism today, which is really a form of nihilism. Finally, the Buddha dismisses ethics and morality as elementary, inferior, trivial, insignificant, and minor matters that may impress common uneducated people, the Puthujjana or Putujjana. But the Tathagata, he who has attained the Tat, suchness, reality, or the Absolute, is far beyond all such considerations, having attained a state beyond reason. The Tathagata is literally described, therefore, as transhuman. The Buddha emphasizes this point by summarizing the rules of morality, including the famous 5 precepts: not killing, not stealing, not lying, not engaging in sexual wrongdoing, and, after about 427 before the Common Era, not drinking alcohol. Alcohol was not originally prescribed by the Buddha, but about 8 years into his mission, he did prescribe it because a monastic got drunk. I forget his name. It was in Kosambi, was the town. I forget the name of the monastic. And a host of other ethical and monastic rules. In fact, pretty much the whole gamut of ethical and monastic rules are cited in the sutta on what the teaching is not. This liberal attitude to rules, which we also find indicated by the Buddha's behavior throughout his life, led to the accusation of laxness, an accusation that also dogged him throughout his career, paradoxically, since the Buddha made the same accusations against the Brahmins, and he also complained himself towards the end of his life about the laxness of the monastics in the Sangha, the Buddha Sangha. The Buddha also rejects 62 kinds of wrong views, including speculative theories about the past and the future. However, he also rejects agnosticism and nihilism, and clearly states that although he discourages speculations, he himself knows the truth concerning these matters, thus contradicting the widespread notion that the Buddha did not have an ontology, a science of being. The form in which the Buddha rejected these theories is the Tetra Lemma, a logical structure that rejects all possible formulations of a proposition, such as that A is not A is both A and not A, and A is neither A nor not A. The Tetra Lemma is not simply a rejection of the premise, otherwise A is not A would be true. Rather, it appears to reject the law of contradiction itself, because absolute truth transcends all forms of logical expression. Thus, that is, it transcends dualistic logic and reason altogether. Thus, the Tetra Lemma appears to refer to the translogical, transdual, translinguistic, and transrational character of the Buddha's realization of truth, rather than simply rejecting a specific doctrinal formulation in favor of its antithesis. The most famous example of this is, of course, the Buddha's rejection of the atta, loosely but inaccurately translated as self. Sometimes you see it translated as ego, the illusory self. The Buddha also rejects the reliability of direct intuition, or the direct realization, rather, or intuition as a source of information. There's several examples of doctrines in the first sutta of the Digha Nikaya that are the result of direct realization or intuition, and he rejects these. So direct realization or intuition by itself is not an absolutely dependable basis for formulating a view. Indeed, all views whatsoever simply lead one to rebirth in whatever world corresponds to that view, that is, if one is attached to them. None is ultimate. Implicitly, therefore, all such views are false and do not lead to ultimate realization, which is inherently empty, uncharacterizable, and dispassionate. Again, one has to apply the qualification, this is only true if one is attached to that view. Next, Vinaya. The Buddha's attitude toward rules is therefore quite ambivalent. On the one hand, he advocates a life of moderate austerity and simplicity based on self-restraint and gives a few basic rules for this. On the other hand, he disparages extreme asceticism and self-torture and dismisses the intrinsic efficacy of rites and rituals. Even ethics are relatively minor. Ethical rules really are a kind of rite or ritual. Thus, he refers to the three higher trainings, in morality, heart, or meditation, and wisdom, which he says is harder but more efficacious than the mere mechanical rules of the code of conduct, the Vinaya, which at that time numbered about 150 rules. Today it's 227 for the male monastics and 311 for the female, I think that's it. And at the end of his life, he conceded that the rules should not be expanded and that the minor and lesser rules could be ignored, a prescription that was ignored by his immediate successors and that actually became the basis of the original schism between the minority Sthavira group, who wanted to hold on to all the rules and add more, and the Mahasangikas, who became the precursors of the Mahayana. This view is, of course, in striking contrast to the organizationalism, hierarchicalism, authoritarianism, and dogmatism of many Buddhist societies and groups today, both in Asia and in the West. Finally, I'd like to talk about politics. The Buddha clearly advocated what today we would call a liberal progressive political philosophy. including animal rights, human rights, and state support of the social infrastructure, including agriculture, capital, a well-paid bureaucracy and working class, and direct democratic government, as well as low taxes and liberal laws. The Pali Canon even presents the Buddha with something resembling the modern right-wing libertarian movement, which is sometimes called neocon, neoliberalism, which he rejects out of hand. Western and indeed global society, under increasing Western domination, appears to be escalating towards a general civil war and perhaps even a world war at this time of social and environmental crisis, with a window to irremediable calamity of perhaps 30 years, based on wantonly spewing carbon into the atmosphere because of burning fossil fuels, so-called climate change. Nothing less than a global spiritual revolution will do. The Buddha is very critical of money and business, associating it with cheating and lying, and the monastics were forbidden from trading, owning property, or handling money, although the Sangha itself owned property which was given to it in the form of donations. The Buddha also criticized property and territoriality, and the most advanced human beings on the northern continent of Uttarakuru were said to be communistic and practiced free love based on the ancient Rishi tradition. And finally, while on this topic of love and women, many of you will know that I have mentioned misogyny quite prominently in these talks, especially in my talk on the status of women in ancient India and the Pali tradition. Interestingly, there are few negative references to women in the Digha Nikaya compared to the later suttas, so we haven't really mentioned this topic too much in our discussions of the Digha Nikaya. However, there are a few fairly minor references. At the end of his life, the Buddha warns Ananda against fraternizing with women, and there is a female spiritual aspirant who vows to be reborn as a man in order to make spiritual progress, who, because of the power of truth, achieves her goal. So on the one hand, this may appear as a form of misogyny, but on the other hand, it also shows that women are capable of spiritual aspiration. On the other hand, there is an ecstatic poem, comparable in some ways to the Song of Solomon, which you may know from the Hebrew Bible, in which arhantship and the love of the Dharma are compared to the love of a woman. And on this note, we'll end the talk and the series of talks on the Digha Nikaya with a short quotation from that poem. Come, embrace me, maiden fair of thighs. Seize and hold me with your lovely eyes. Take me in your arms, it's all I ask. My desire was slight at first, O maid of waving tresses, but it grew apace as grow the gifts that arahants receive. Namaskar. Thank you very much for attending the series of talks, which is now concluded. So, before we conclude with the dedication of merit, whereby we dedicate the merit of this talk to all beings, does anyone have any questions, comments, or discussion? And while you're thinking about that, I'll just pull up the text of the dedication of merit, which I still have not memorized. This is, by the way, the dedication of merit used by Alex Berzin, which I have stolen from him because I'm so fond of it. Comments, questions, or discussion before we conclude and retire to the Droma Lakang temple for informal Dharma chat, if anyone's interested in doing that. Okay, it appears not, so let's conclude with the dedication of merit. Whatever understanding, whatever positive force has come from this, may it go deeper and deeper and act as a cause to reach enlightenment for the benefit of all. Thank you very much for this opportunity during the previous 34 or so weeks to discuss Dharma. It is my pleasure and privilege. Until next time, Namaskar.